Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Tech.com video, we're going to be discussing recent reports that various titles on the next generation consoles, that would be, for example, Killer Instinct, Battlefield 4, and much more besides, are actually running less than 1080p, in some cases 720p, and at 30 frames per second. In some cases, developers have actually said and gone on record that the games are comparable to, say, medium to high settings on a PC. And I've been following up with that by reading quite a lot of message boards and various forums, of course, across the internets. And there's a mixed feeling about this. Some people are actually pretty damn angry. Some people have been blaming the developers, so for example DICE. Other people have been blaming Sony and Microsoft. And I think it's just a good chance for us to start to discuss this. I'm going to lead this off with a quote from DICE, and it's not the beginning of the interview, but I think it sets the tone for it. DICE said, and I quote, "Then the question is, could they have done more? Yes. Would it have cost the same? No. It would have cost twice the price. Would that be a reasonable thing to sell consumers? Probably not." And this is a really good example of what I've been saying for a long time. You can't just take a console, for example the PlayStation 4 or the Xbox One, price it at X, whatever the console may cost, and expect it to be able to compete with a high-spec PC. So what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be discussing this quite in depth, and we're going to be discussing what realistic expectations should be for next generation games. I'm not coming in this, by the way, with any biased thoughts or opinions. I am genuinely curious to see what some of you guys actually say about this. If you want to reach me directly, of course, you can do so through Facebook. That would be facebook.com/redgamingtech. So we're going to be listening to some interviews from the guys in the know, for example DICE, or the developers of Killer Instinct and Call of Duty and so on, and we're going to be discussing, what their results are, what their thoughts are on the future, and we're also going to be discussing comments from other industry leaders. For example, I'm sure you're aware of a fellow named John Carmack and what his thoughts are for the future. So I'm going to go back a little bit, going to hit the rewind button on the interview with DICE, and we're going to be listening to a series of quotes from, well, I say listening, I'll read them out, from executive producer Patrick Bach. I'll read out his name, that's B-A-C-H, and he's been telling Videogamer.com, and I quote, that DICE is doing as much as it can with next-gen versions, but we need to compromise in some places. He also added, from a GPU/CPU perspective, no, the PS4 and Xbox Ones cannot match PC. However, he was quick to add the following: "I think it's cool that we have something extremely excited about, and you will for the first time get a full Battlefield experience on a console. It's the same core, it's the same game, it's the same feature set, there's nothing left out, so to speak. But there's also 64 players, 60 frames per second experience that you haven't really seen on a console previously, which will move it up a big notch and eliminate some of the gap between the PC and the console." Now, in case you're not exactly sure what he means by that, of course there is typically a large difference between the PC versions of certain titles and, say, an Xbox 360. And don't get me wrong, I completely understand the reasons behind that. I mean, look how old the Xbox 360 hardware is. This is just a simple fact. It's like, 8 years now, basically? And there's no way that you can expect hardware of that age to be able to perform as well as, say, 3-year or 2-year-old PC hardware. Meanwhile, let's hear from Double Helix Games. Double Helix, of course, are responsible for developing the Xbox One's Killer Instinct, which obviously is going to be a launch title for the Xbox One. And they are, just like DICE, trying to stick to 60 frames per second. Now, they answered on what resolution the title was running at. Technically, we are running at 720p and 60 frames per second. 60 FPS is another pillar in the project. Anything added to the game that doesn't allow us to run at 60 frames per second is removed or optimized. Nothing would be more frustrating than need pixel-perfect accuracy at anything below 60 frames per second. It would feel sluggish and unresponsive. End quote for just a moment. So, I think some people are going to immediately ask, well, is this a case of developers simply not knowing the hardware? In other words, to put it a different way, I'm sure you've heard me use this example before, but launch games, of course, invariably look considerably worse than titles that are released, let's say 3 years later, right? Because obviously developers are much more comfortable with the hardware. There have been maybe updates to the system which have improved performance. For example, they may get back more memory or maybe better APIs or whatever. And of course, the most important thing is the developers, though, are more comfortable with the hardware. They understand better programming techniques, there are better libraries available, so much more besides. And so they are able to get much better performance out of the game. They are able to take a basic engine and they are able to adapt. More than that, they are no longer focused on cross-generational development. In other words, they are no longer worried about making an engine that works for the lowest common denominator. We're talking, of course, about making the title work for, say, the Xbox 360 as well as, say, the Xbox One. So you can much better optimize performance. Now, obviously, for the most part, some studios, they'll have, say, two sets of developers, one working on the old generation, one working on the new, but oftentimes there is a lot of crossover, or maybe just increase of, say, the texture quality or whatever for the newer consoles. It really depends, obviously, on the direction they go. However, generally, the best titles, the ones that look the best, the ones that perform the best, the ones that, have the best graphics, the best, the ones that are basically pushing the technical envelope, let's go with that, are the system-exclusive games. So, for example, that would be the Gears of War. That would be, say, God of War. In other words, from first-party developers, because it's their sole mission in life that this is the platform we've got to work on. It doesn't matter if we love it, it doesn't matter if we hate it, we have to use it the best we can and get the most out of it. So I think some people are going to go into this fairly annoyed. I mean, I've heard some people say, well, why the hell are we dealing with graphics that are 720p now? Why are we dealing with graphics that are, less than 60, or games that are less than 60 frames per second in some cases? Why are we dealing with that? Why aren't we getting 60 FPS and 1080p? That's kind of a easy question to answer, actually. It's simply because it requires a lot more power. It's not just a simple case of, it's only it's only 720p versus 1080p, it's only a little bit more performance difference. No, it's not. If you guys have ever gamed on, say, a PC, and if you have, then you'll be a bit more understanding of this. Take a technically demanding game, say, for example, Crysis 3, take a game that, or anything that gives you a frames per second indicator, run it at, say, 1080p, and then reduce the resolution to, say, 720p, and you can see a difference in frames per second. In some cases, it could be, 30, 40, 50%, depending on the engine, depending on the settings, depending on how much memory and so on was being used on the graphics card, and a lot more besides. Some of this does depend on other situations as well. For example, how held back the game is by the CPU. For example, if the CPU is the thing that's struggling to run the game rather than, say, the GPU, then reducing the resolution isn't typically going to work too well. So in other words, let's assume that you've got a new system, say a new system, but you're waiting for a new graphics card to arrive. That's a pretty classic one. It's happened to me a couple of times as well. I typically try to time my upgrade when new GPUs come out, so I'll buy the CPU and everything else, but the GPU, I'm still waiting for it. It's being shipped, or I have to wait a day or two for the release date, or it sells out, whatever, you know the stories. So what happens? Well, those familiar with PC gaming or gaming will know that it's quite simple. The CPU is going to be a lot faster than what the GPU can put out, so your old GPU is simply not going to be able to keep up with the CPU. So in other words, if you reduce the resolution, you're going to get a lot more performance because the GPU is the culprit. On the other hand, if the reverse is true, and you buy, say, a new GPU, and you're waiting for, so let's say, for example, you're waiting for a new CPU range to come out, but you think, screw it, I'm sick of playing with these crappy graphics at 720p, at least I can install my new graphics card while I'm waiting. And of course you can do that, but what you might find is that you can play from, say, 720 to 1080 and get absolutely no frames per second drop, or very few. But you won't find you're getting that much more performance. So let's just assume that you're getting 30 frames per second at 720p. You put in a much faster GPU, it could be 3 times faster. You might find you're getting 30 to 31 frames per second at 1080p. The simple reason is your CPU can't supply the data fast enough to the GPU. In other words, it's just being held back. But the high resolution and whatever else doesn't bother the GPU, so you might as well just pile on the anti-aliasing or whatever else in the meanwhile. Of course, we are still very early in the development of the next generation consoles. I mean, for goodness sake, as of the time I'm recording this, is the 6th of September, I think? Yes, it is. It's not even released yet. Neither of them are released yet. We've still got a couple of months. And even if you're watching this in a year's time, it's, it's still really early. And people have this expectation of a ridiculous amount of performance. And this is something that I've been saying for a while now. And I don't mean it to sound fanboyish. It's not supposed to be. I don't, care about the system I'm gaming on. I just want to play the damn games, to be honest. Which is why I've never subscribed to the point of view that you should be defensive over a certain system. The PC has a ridiculous amount of issues, the PlayStation 4 is going to have a ridiculous amount of issues, and the Xbox One. And I'm not necessarily saying massive issues, I'm just saying that they will have certain issues that are inherent to that system. And it could be that one of the systems crashes a lot. It could be that one of the systems has audio issues. Or it could be that the system overheats. Or it could be that the online sucks or whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. There's always, something wrong with a system. And that's just how gaming is. Nothing is perfect because, well, if it was perfect, there would be no need to improve on it for the next generation. Look how much a PlayStation 4 costs, and look what you're getting for that amount of money. You're basically getting an all-in-one system that can do tons of different things. However, despite the fact, of course, Sony have made significant changes to it, as have Microsoft for the Xbox One, they can only do so much. They can't basically come ridiculously out of profit, and be fair, okay, they could have put in a GPU, just for example, that would have more power behind it. Let's say they'd have put in a 24 GCN cores. Let's say they'd put in 32, whatever amount they'd put in. The problem is, all of this increases the manufacturing cost, the heat, the power requirements, the chance of the system actually dying. Because let's face it, the more parts that system has, the more chance that just one of them is going to go. For example, let's assume that you have 32, GCN cores on your graphics card inside the PlayStation 4. It's not like if one of those goes, the console is just going to slow down a little bit. It's not. The whole thing is going to just not work anymore. And that's the same with, say, if you've got a faulty RAM chip. Same situation. Technologically, both systems, the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, have a lot to give. And by which I mean that both have compute, for example. Both have a pretty complicated architecture. I would argue that they are probably going to be fairly simple to use, but very difficult to master to get everything out of it. In other words, the developers have said, well, yes, it's actually pretty easy to port our titles over. But when you're just simply porting the titles over and you're not really used to doing the optimizations that are necessary to get the most out of the hardware. Now, don't get me wrong, for an indie developer now, it doesn't really matter about making too many optimizations for the hardware because the PlayStation 4 is so powerful. The titles on, well, most indie titles, I'm not saying all, because some obviously are pretty power hungry, but most of them don't really require that much optimization. Optimization, one of the primary reasons to do it, is to make the title run faster. In other words, to make the code run faster, to reduce the size of textures, to reduce the size, or sometimes reduce, say, polygon count. on models. This is particularly true if you're, say, far away from those models. You can reduce, say, the animation quality of them. You can reduce the polygon count of them so they're no longer quite as complicated. A typical example of that, this is just a really basic one, certainly not particularly in depth, but let's assume that you have a polygon model of a character. It doesn't matter what that character is. Let's assume that you're playing a game like, say, The Last of Us on the next generation. Let's assume that one of the polygon models of that character, let's just call them Tom. Let's say that Tom's polygon for his whole body, including his head, his hands, everything, his clothing, let's say it's 40,000 polygons. Let's say you have 3 LODs, 3 level of details for Tom. Let's assume that when you're really close to Tom, so in other words, let's say in real terms, let's say 10 to 15 feet max, Tom is showing all 40,000 of his polygons, so all of the animation detail on there, all of the texture quality you'd expect, blah blah blah. However, let's assume that Tom is no longer as close. Let's assume Tom is now 40 feet away in reality terms, whatever that is. You get the idea. And let's assume that there's another LOD level. Let's assume from 40,000 polygons he drops to, say, 25,000. Let's assume that he goes a little bit further still. He might then drop to, say, 15,000 polygons. The same thing goes for characters in games. Imagine, for example, you're walking through a really, really, really busy city. Not all characters, if they're really, really far away, they don't need to be at high level of details. By the way, guys, I'm actually going to be putting out a video very soon on this exact same situation to show it off in much more detail, because I know it's kind of a complicated subject and you might not grasp it 100%, which is understandable. It's actually a really complicated subject. I don't know what the hell has happened to my grasp of the English language in the last 2 minutes, but whatever. So a lot of this goes to optimization. It's even things such as better programming techniques. Obviously, both systems are going to be using APIs that are very similar to DirectX 11. And obviously, for example, the Xbox One has tiled resources. But most of this is going to come down to how well the developers themselves are comfortable, or how familiar they are with optimization for the console, and how well they actually, how much they feel it's important, how important they feel it is to say, well, okay, we're going to spend some time optimizing this, because let's assume that the game runs pretty damn well, but it could run, let's say, a little bit better. Let's say the internal resolution rendering-wise is, let's just say, I don't know, let's just make it up. Let's say it's 900p. They feel that if they did a lot of optimization, say 3 months worth on that title for that specific console, they could get it all the way up to 1080p. They would have to balance it and say, is it worth us putting this amount of time and resources into this title to make this game run at 1080p on this specific platform, or should we just do the best we can, spend a couple of weeks to make sure that the frame rate is relatively solid and go from there? There's not going to be just a straight answer. In other words, it depends on the game, it depends on development time, it depends on their budget, it depends on how well the game they feel is going to do at retail, on what system they feel it's going to sell best on. For example, they might find in their research that the PlayStation 4 sells better on that type of game than the Xbox One, and therefore they feel that they should put the extra time into that title on the PS4 to do the extra optimization. Maybe the Xbox One version is the one that's struggling on this particular title because of its architecture, and they feel that the Xbox One doesn't really sell that well on these particular titles. Let's say it's a JRPG and they don't feel that there's enough of an audience. It's very difficult to say. In other words, there's not going to be one flat answer for this. Now, before any PC owners get too smug, I'd also like to point out that this can also affect us as PC gamers as well. I say us because I'm going to be gaming on PC and PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, so there you have it. Just to lay my cards on the table. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to be getting the hugely superior versions. It may be a simple case of we get better textures. The Call of Duty guys, or the guys behind, say, Ghosts, have said straight up we are going to be getting better textures than PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. However, we're not going to be getting situations where, for the most part, we have very specific modes or whatever. So sure, we are going to be getting maybe slightly better graphics, maybe slightly faster frames per second, we might get whatever else, but we're not going to be getting hugely better experiences in some cases, despite the fact that our COD systems could technically handle it. But once again, this depends upon the developer. For example, the developers behind, say, The Witcher, Battlefield, and so on, they might decide to really start to push towards PC gaming more. We do know that PC gaming is going to become a lot more popular and a lot easier to port. It's really been a nightmare beforehand for developers because of the PowerPC architecture. So, what are my thoughts on this? I mean, it's kind of like a subject that doesn't really have an easy answer, because people expect better, right? This is something I've been saying for a long time, and I've been kind of warning people. When you look at the back of a game's case, right, let's assume that you don't really know much about gaming. Obviously, if you're watching this channel, you probably do, right? I'm just putting that out there. Generally speaking, my viewers are or viewers who watch this type of content are fairly well informed. But let's assume that you are not someone who's pretty informed. Let's assume that all you know is that this game looks better graphically than the previous generation, or maybe better than that game over there. So you've got two games in your hand, and you're just like, they're both, first-person shooters or whatever game. What should I buy? And you're just looking at the back of the box at the cool characters and the artwork. You don't really know which game you're buying. You've got, let's assume, for example, you're in the United Kingdom, you've got £40 in your pocket, or I imagine that'd be about $60 in the States. You've got that cash burning in your pocket. You want to buy a game. It's Thursday, Friday, whatever. You want to go home. You want to play with some friends. You're looking at the two titles, and you think, okay, this looks a bit better graphically. I'm going to go with this title. In other words, it's very difficult to show off. Well, this game runs at 60 frames per second on a screenshot. Now, that might sound really petty, but you've got to remember that a lot of games, the primary way they're marketed is through, YouTube videos, trailers, images in magazines, reviews. Okay, of course, titles, for example, that we show off on YouTube or whatever, they do well. So in other words, I'm talking about user-generated content that can have a massive impact on the sales of games. But ultimately, it also comes down to how pretty the back of the box looked. I mean, I'm not even going to go too much into this, but if you want a bit of an interesting read, you should check out the Booker and Elizabeth comments on BioShock Infinite. I'm not going to talk to you about it too much, but there was a huge uproar about whether Elizabeth was actually added to the front cover of the BioShock Infinite, or whether she was relegated to the back, and it was a massive issue, females in gaming and so forth. You should check it out. But there's actually one of the reasons behind it because of marketing. And this is really the thing, they spend a lot of money doing research on this, and ultimately, we might really like pretty graphics. You and I might think that 60 frames per second, and this is, you thought I forgot, didn't you? John Carmack, for example, he stated quite clearly that he thinks that we have the technology now, with the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, to make porting a lot easier. AMD have said the same thing. One of the great things about AMD, and this is what they are saying, of course, I'm not, acting as an AMD spokesperson, but they say that, their technology makes it a hell of a lot easier to port games from each platform. So in other words, bring it to the PC, bring it to the PlayStation 4, bring it to the Xbox One, it makes little difference. You just do the tweaking in the back end to make sure the code runs great, maybe a bit of optimization or whatever you need to do, and it's great. It's fun and it's fantastic. It makes development and porting a lot cheaper anyway, let's put it that way. And John Carmack has said quite categorically, stated this, that he doesn't want a situation where we're going to be seeing sub 1080p. He doesn't want a situation, more importantly to him, where we're going to be seeing 30 frames per second. But these are development choices. Now, obviously, in certain games, for example, turn-based strategy, in games such as, say, Diablo, or obviously that's not turn-based strategy, but you know what I mean, on games like Diablo, on titles like, say, Final Fantasy, it doesn't 30 frames per second is fine, it's acceptable, because it's not like the reactions have to be on a dime. In other words, you don't have to react instantly. On other games, like, for example, let's say a fighting game, let's say Killer Instinct, just, we'll pick on it because the developers have already spoken out, so might as well continue to pick on them for a moment. Not in a nasty way, I'm just, saying. Let's just use those guys as an example. We know that they want 60 frames per second. It's the same as like Street Fighter and other most fighting games anyway. Even, for example, back in the day, I remember playing titles like Virtual Fighter 2, and they did the best for the PAL versions. I'm not sure if you guys are really familiar with that, PAL versus NTSC. It was a really massive thing back in the day of like the PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn and so on. And one of the things that a lot of people did is that they did the switch from make basically the PAL version 17.5% faster for the PAL versus NTSC. NTSC basically has less. This is a long time ago. This is like the old television standards, but basically we had less lines, or sorry, the NTSC version had less lines, so the picture quality was technically a little bit worse. But our television refresh in the UK was a bit slower, 17.5%. And in some games, they did optimization, for example, with Virtua Fighter 2. So if you actually flip the switch on the back of your Saturn, I actually had my Saturn converted, and when you flip the switch, it made the game like really, 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 really too fast. But for other games that weren't optimized, for example, X-Men Children of the Atom or Marvel Superheroes, which had better versions in the PlayStation anyway, but when you actually flipped the switch and it got rid of the letterbox, in other words, the bars at the top and bottom of the screen, I'm sure you know what a letterbox is anyway, but whatever, and it made the game 70.5% faster, and holy crap, the difference. It was, it doesn't sound much, it doesn't, but remember, this is a constant frame rate, yeah? So the game suddenly became a lot smoother, it felt a lot better to play, the combos floated more naturally. I don't know if you've ever played like a versus game, like for example, Marvel Superheroes, Marvel vs. Capcom, something like that. But if you've ever played it, you'll know that when you're fighting, when you're playing, it doesn't matter how good you are, but if you're just doing like a basic aerial string, it's kind of like one of those things you do intuitively. In other words, you're like light, medium, heavy. I'm talking about the old combo system, so you'd be like light punch, light kick, medium kick, fierce punch. Just for example, a really simple basic combo. And what used to happen is on the PAL versions, especially with some characters, you would have to it would be really difficult to actually time it. At least I found so. I was pretty young at the time, mind, but whatever. And what you'd do is you'd start tapping like light. So you'd be like light punch, light kick, and that would be like, you'd be pressing it really fast, but that would help to just do the timing, so you'd basically press each button twice, rather than just like 1, 2, light punch, light kick, it'd be like light punch, light kick, and it would just be an easy way to time it. In other words, of course, you wouldn't be cancelling animation, because you can't cancel 2 light punches really, really quickly like that. So it was just an easy way to do it, and I know that sounds a really boring, crappy explanation, but it's just something I'm trying to say. In other words, it's one of those games where it's really sensitive to frame rate, and when you basically take a game and it's no longer running as smoothly and as optimally as it should be, you can really notice it. At least I can on certain games. Tekken 3, for example, the PAL versions, it's just like, oh dear. I remember initially playing it, and then I played like the arcade, and then I imported I can't remember what it was now, I think it was an American version, it might have been Japanese or American, whatever it was, and the difference is like night and day. Anyway, guys, I'm getting quite dangerously close to the 30-minute mark, and I typically try to keep these videos around the 30-minute mark, because I get a couple of complaints with buffer time issues and stuff like that from you guys otherwise, and that's understandable. I understand that most of you don't have time to watch like an hour-long video in one sitting, but yeah, so I think this is going to be like a situation that's going to develop over time. I'm probably going to release another video on this subject, because it's quite a long one, and there's some stuff that I haven't done super amounts of research on that would like to add to this in the not too distant future. I want to add some more interview questions and stuff. that I didn't really get time to, but that's just unfortunately how it goes. I would, however, like to hear your thoughts on this before we continue the debate and discussion. So what I would like you to do is you can message on Facebook. That would be facebook.com/RedGamingTech. I am genuinely curious to see how people feel about this, because it's one of those situations a lot of people seem to understand, that you can't have a £400 console, £350 console, whatever it costs, and expect that system to outperform a high-end PC. But others have also accused it and said, you know what, I wanted more. I mean, I'm going to be really honest, like painfully so, that I did want a little bit more power from both consoles. And I'm not the only one. A couple of guys at Epic, and you can Google all this stuff, by the way, feel free to, verify what I'm saying. A couple of guys have actually said, have actually said, you know what, we wanted 2.5 T-flops, and what demo was that? I think it was the Samaritan demo. I'm almost positive it was the Samaritan demo. It was 2.5 T-flops. And the reason that they wanted 2.5 T-flops is they didn't really expect to maybe get exactly 2.5. They maybe thought 2.2, 2.3. But the reason that they created that demo is they were saying, look what we could do with best results with this amount of power. Remember, though, it is only a tech demo. I'm going to talk about that in another video because it's a really complicated subject and one that really merits its own discussion. But, a tech demo doesn't necessarily equal to the graphics we're going to be getting in reality, but still, they're just saying, look at all the effects we can do, look at all the shyness we can do in best case scenarios when we don't have to process other data. And they were a little bit disappointed. That's been, that has been said before. You can check that out. They've even said that they had to remove a few effects from the new Unreal engines, and this is not me just making this stuff up. As I said, you can verify the results, and I genuinely am curious to see what you guys think of this subject. I will be putting out another video maybe a week or so when I've got some responses on it, because I'm just curious what people think. Because, as I said, a couple of forums on this, especially on the Killer Instinct and the Battlefield, and obviously Battlefield fans are, the Call of Duty and Battlefield fans are really, really passionate about their titles, which is understandable. Great, you love your game, that's fantastic. And, they have been fairly vocal about this, so I'm just curious about what you guys think. Anyway, that's about it for this particular video. It's been fairly lengthy, as you can see, but I think it's good to, discuss this stuff. But regardless, I'll see you guys soon, hopefully. Take care, and bye for now.